Hello, today we're going to talk about the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. These are both topics that I think really deserve not only a full class for each one of them, but maybe even a full semester for each one of them. But obviously, we have to cover so much in our one semester, our 500 years of world history from everywhere, that we're going to cram it all in to today. First, I want to start off with a review. And just kind of keep us focused on where we've been so far. Last class, we talked at the beginning about the Age of Exploration and Columbian Exchange. Just to remember that these are actually going on at the exact same time as the Renaissance. These are not separate, that while all of the stuff going on in the video that you watch, the Renaissance says, we have also this massive change, and you can look closely, see this list of crops and animals and diseases that are going to affect everything about daily life as the world kind of focus turns from the Indian Ocean basin and the Pacific gradually over more towards the Atlantic area. So just something to keep in mind. We looked at the Spanish piece of 8 coin as a really good archetypal example for the kinds of international global connections that are going on in this time period with this trade. So we have silver that is mined by probably mostly indigenous people in Bolivia, in Spanish controlled South America, and then taken by ships to Spain, minted, and then sent. Some of it stays in Spain and causes massive inflation, but others of it goes across Europe and actually across the world. We talked before about how there's not a lot of goods that the Europeans are producing that other people in the rest of the world want, but the Chinese do want silver. They have to pay their taxes in silver. And so we see these coins even making their way over to China, over to Australia, Indonesia, and used as currency there. So I think it's a good way to kind of signal and think about the vast changes that are going on, beginning in the 1500s, obviously carrying through. The main point of what we talked about last time was absolutism, this approach to ruling, sometimes called absolute monarchy, that we see virtually everywhere in the 15 and 1600s. Mughal India and the Ottoman Empire, that's reinforced by even just the way they controlled their art from the top down, art and architecture production, as you saw in the Renaissance's video. We also talked last class briefly about Qing China, about Kangxi, and we also talked about Peter the Great and the beards, remember? And then, of course, in France, here we have Louis XIV, and this sense of control. The reading by Buzbek was about the Ottoman Empire and Roxelana and Suleiman, and this anxiety over who will be the next ruler. Kind of that's part of the issue of absolutism, this control over who gets to be in charge and who gets a say. We see there. We also had the Frederick William writing where he gives advice to his son about how to rule. And a lot of this was about crafting an appearance. And we see that in this painting of Louis here, right? This appearance of majesty, this appearance of power. And of course, through actual power, both Frederick William and the French kings are very concerned about controlling religion, who gets to practice where, what kind of religious education is given to children. And we see that in some of those documents as well. Overall, the goal of absolute rulers is not to terrorize their people, right, but to rule successfully and have them be economically strong, and so that you leave to your son and grandson a nation ready to hold its own in a competing world, whether that is Europe and the sibling rivalry we see there, or really across the way with the Ottoman Empire, the Mughals, even over to China and Russia. The kind of exception that proves the rule here is the story of limited monarchy in England, and we talked about that at the very end of the last lecture. England suffers a variety of range of political turmoil in the 1600s, civil war, and then a revolution. And basically, these actions solidified the English preference for limited monarchy. Limited meaning this monarch has to answer to a constitution, or in England's case, to a legislature, to the parliament, which are shoring up their ability to influence how they are ruled in England. And the image here of Charles, the only king executed, was executed after the English Civil War. This is a good place to kind of stop the review and think about a concept that you encounter with Locke, John Locke, but also other thinkers as well. Thomas Hobbes is one good example, Rousseau is another. And it's the social contract theory of government. And so we're going to talk a lot today about theories of government and about how to rule. And so the social contract theorists think about what is life like before there's any government. I'm kind of thinking of it as like we're all cave people. You're running around, you're born, you're living free, completely free, right? Free to crush each other if someone has something you want, right? And the state of nature, meaning your natural state as you were born, human nature, right, ties into that. Social contract theorists imagine, they're not there, right? They're like in their study with their pens, but they're imagining that there was a time when people chose to come together, right? And they come together, why? So this is part of about the theorists. They come together to make society run more smoothly. Maybe they come together to protect each other from each other, maybe from outsiders. But they come together and they form a contract between the ruler and the ruled. And the ruler promises to give them something, right? Otherwise you wouldn't have a contract. And the ruled promise to give up some rights, right? They're not going to live in total freedom anymore to do whatever they want. Now they're in a society, they're going to have to follow rules and work together. How much do citizens give up? Who do they give up to? Can they take these back? Theorists disagree. We're going to focus on the theories of John Locke in his second treatise on government from 1689, which is just at the end of what's called the Glorious Revolution, which is a tip-off of its mostly nonviolent nature in England. And John Locke is important not only for European history, but of course for American history as well, because he is on the bedside table of the American revolutionaries. They know their Locke, and so we'll come back to him next week when we talk about the American Revolution and the French Revolution. For John Locke, he says there are certain things that everyone's born with, right? It's in your nature. The right to life, liberty, and property. He says nobody can take those away. None of these cave people would make an agreement, would make a social contract with a ruler that involved them giving away those things. Why would you give away those things? Those are the things, in Locke's mind, that's the function of government, right? So you would never form a society that involved you giving up those rights. That's illogical to him. And so in the treatise, as you read, he talks about the relationship of a master and servants, of a father, or he calls it the pater familias, over the wife, the children, the servants, the slaves, and then also, of course, the monarch. And he says, if you look at those, it really doesn't make sense that any of those arrangements, that person, that master, father, monarch, should have absolute power over anybody, except a slave. And he said slaves, in his mind, are POWs justly captured. He's living at a time when that's not the only people that are slaves, and I think he probably knows full well. But we'll talk about slavery in the future. Transatlantic European slavery. African slavery. But I think this idea, as you saw, he talks about, it doesn't really make sense that certainly a father doesn't have the right of life or death over his children, nor does a master over his servants or boss over his employees, and therefore a monarch can't have it over there. So he's kind of extrapolating and thinking about this natural rights. This is a really important idea because what he's doing is undermining the case that a ruler can do whatever a ruler wants. Because for him, it's very important that the ruler have accountability. And if you've got a ruler who's not accountable, right, who holds himself above the law, who doesn't follow the same rules as everybody else, that's not a fair system. That's not a just system. And so if a king is taking away your liberties, your property, your right to life, then this ruler is no longer allowed to be the ruler. And so Locke recommends, not necessarily in the aspect, the part you read, but Locke allows for breaking that contract. Walk away from that contract. And you're not a terrorist and you're not a traitor. You're just somebody sort of terminating your relationship with this ruler who's not following their own responsibilities. Okay, next let's move on and talk about the scientific revolution, also based in Europe. And again, look at the dates here. This is going on at the same time as the Renaissances, as Michelangelo, as Suleimani Mosque is going up, right? So this is sort of meanwhile, and look at this other area, this intellectual fervent going on. And this is, I think, one of the most important moments of modern history is when Europeans figure out about the scientific method. So we're going to talk here about the new cosmology, the new view of the universe, cosmos, the scientific method, and then a little bit in particular about Galileo and the clash between science and religion. Before we do all that, we have to understand the old way of thinking before we understand what's new. So the old view of the universe before the scientific revolution is that the earth is the center of everything. what a nice place to be, right? Don't we all want to be the center of the universe? We have here a drawing that kind of lays that out, right? Here's humans and Earth, and then everything else is moving around Earth, and people knew full well they could watch stars change and planets move, and so they're aware of what's going on in the heavens. Aristotle had speculated that everything on Earth was made of material that was corruptible. It would decay, it would fall apart. It's not perfect. Whereas everything outside of Earth was made of quintessence, was perfect, with no blemishes, because it was in the heavens. And so I think we're gonna get back to that in a second. So this old view starts to come under fire, beginning with Copernicus, who was a Polish astronomer, and Copernicus has in his life noticed that the system with the Earth at the center, it doesn't really work to explain kind of mathematically what's going on with the planets. When you watch the planets, it doesn't really work. You've got to come up with all of these different, they're called like epicycles, like, oh, Jupiter goes around and then turns the other way, then goes back around, because they can't explain it, right? Because it's not, the geocentric, the Earth-centered view is not correct, right? So just as he is on his deathbed, he puts together this really famous book on the revolutions of heavenly spheres, which is published only after his death in 1543. And in it, he sort of postulates, he posits, he ventures, maybe it'd be easier if the sun's the center, right? And so here we have a diagram from his book, that if the sun's the center, everything can make a little bit more sense. But he doesn't really have the proof. He doesn't have the math. It's just really a conjecture, a theory. Others also are concerned with cosmology. Tycho Brahe, who's Danish, is observing the heavens with a natural eye, actually, not even a telescope. It's quite impressive. Taking these meticulous notes. He dies. Kepler gets Brahe's notes, and then Kepler's German, and he starts to think, here's what would make sense. If it's an Earth-centered universe, if it's a sun-centered universe with elliptical orbits. Did you guys ever have to learn about Kepler's constant maybe in math? I haven't had math in a long time, but I do remember that. So Kepler starts, so everyone, like, piece by piece, different people from different parts of Europe, right, are exchanging ideas, building on each other's ideas to try to figure out how the heavens really work. And into this steps Galileo Galilei, who's an Italian. He's from, born in this, you can see his dates, 15 and 1600s. And so in his letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, you can see that he has come under fire. He is very seen as aggressively promoting the idea of a sun-centered universe. And part of that is because he has taken a lens he doesn't invent the telescope, but he's one of the first ones to take this lens and kind of look up at the sky. And what he sees are spots on the sun, craters on the moon, new moons orbiting planets, things that nobody had seen before. And he says, look at all of this. All of this proves that the Earth-centered universe theory is wrong. And so Galileo gets in hot water, in part because he's clashing with the Roman Catholic Church. And Galileo is, in fact, a practicing Roman Catholic, and he doesn't want to get in trouble with the church. He's good friends with people in the church. He goes to church. He's not interested in bringing down kind of the prevailing religious system, but he is interested in promoting science. And you can see he's very defensive in this letter, because he feels like he's being attacked by other priests, not really for religious reasons, but for political reasons. And I think he's onto something here, because I think what's happening is that starts to be a war in European society over knowledge, right? Who knows what is true? We have some of these same conversations in our 20s life as well. How do we know what's true, right? And so knowledge, before the scientific revolution, you know something's true because an authority told you it was true. Maybe that authority is Aristotle. Maybe that authority is your parents. Maybe it's your priest. Maybe it's your college professor, right? Maybe it's a book that you read, right? So we have these authorities saying this is true. And Galileo gets so frustrated because he can look at something and then someone says, oh, I see what you're saying, but Aristotle says something different. So I'm going to go with Aristotle, even though I can see with my eyes what you're telling me is true. And this is the same kind of thing he finds with this tension with the Bible. And so I think he comes up with a really brilliant idea, although ultimately he doesn't convince the church. But he tries to account for this irreconcilable conclusions. If the Bible seems to say that the earth is the center of the universe, but Galileo thinks science shows the sun is the center of the universe, what to do? And his solution is, the problem is not the Bible. The Bible can never be wrong. Obviously, he says, right? The problem is in us interpreting the Bible, that we are looking at it and we're not understanding that the Bible is symbolic. The Bible is complicated. The Bible is full of metaphors and images. And so when we try to take that at face value, right? He says the Bible tells us the way to get to heaven, not the way the heavens go. And so we're looking for the wrong kinds of authority in the Bible, is Galileo's argument. Ultimately, he's not convincing, and he does end up later in his life, well, he's twice gets in trouble, and he ends up being brought in front of the Inquisition and convicted of heresy, and he has to live the last the months, years of his life in house arrest. But he's not executed, but he does go ahead and recant and say, fine, I'm wrong and the church is right, kind of famously not really believing it. The key to all of this, right, and part of the story, at the bottom of my slide, I've written a reminder, that heliocentrism, right, the idea, Copernicus's ideas are confirmed finally with Newton's Principia, the Englishman, Isaac Newton, and finally he comes up with the law of gravity, right, he finds the mathematical theory that therefore can explain it. And after we get to Newton, you can't really argue with the scientists about how the universe works. So that's after Galileo. But underpinning all of this, I think, is important, is the scientific method. And this is really such an important way for Europe to distinguish what's true and what's not true. And it's really revolutionary, even though you can see this revolution takes 150 years by the time we get from Copernicus to Newton. But it revolutionizes the way that thinking people who are discovering, inventors, scientists, the way that they understand the production of knowledge. And so this is why I think Galileo is onto something vital here, that the problem is not what science says. The problem is who gets to say how things work. Is it Aristotle? Is it the church? Is it your parents? Is it your university, right? Or is it something else? And that's this tension that's kind of brewing as we look at the scientific revolution. I've just got here, I'm sure you guys are you've all had science more recently than I have, but just kind of a reminder of the experiment, make a hypothesis, do an experiment, write down your conclusions, do the experiment again, kind of idea for what is actually involved. But of course, if you do a scientific experiment in Poland, you should be able to write it down and replicate it in Italy and in Denmark and in England, if it's universally true. And so that's part of the sharing of knowledge that's going on at this time period. I think Galileo would agree with the astronomer today, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who says the good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it, right? And that's sort of Galileo's frustration trying to deal with the church. Let's move on and spend the next bit of time. I know I'm going really fast, but you can pause and rewind. So the next I want to talk about the Enlightenment in Europe, and this is really the next intellectual movement. By now, the Renaissance is over, and the scientific revolution, people are still making scientific discoveries, but the idea of the scientific method is well ingrained. And we get to what historians label the Enlightenment, or sometimes it's called the Age of Reason, in Europe as well. It's centered really in France, although people from all over the Western world participate in it. Usually the minds involved are called the philosophes. I have a bad French accent, but that is French for philosopher. So we have these philosophes exchanging ideas. Many of them are in Paris, but many of them are back at home writing and circulating ideas. We're going to look specifically at Kant, Voltaire, and Wollstonecraft, but also you've heard of Thomas Jefferson. He's an Enlightenment thinker. Montesquieu, Diderot, Cesare Beccaria in Italy, Adam Smith in Scotland. If you've heard of these people, just kind of throw a bunch of names at you to ring some bells to connect up with this Enlightenment project that we see kind of, really, really hitting the middle of the century, but brewing beforehand. And then you'll see kind of, we know what's going to happen in the 1770s and 1780s. And we'll talk about the rise of print culture and the public sphere. The main thing I think, and I really want to hit this home, we're going to mention it probably at the beginning of the next 2 or 3 lectures, is the ideas of the Enlightenment. I think we're all children of the Enlightenment, whether you realize it or not, because society is so profoundly shaped by what goes on here. Basically, these thinkers, these philosophes, they're hoping, their dream is to apply some of the methods that these scientists have used to crack open the codes of how the universe works and how blood circulates and how organs work. I mean, they're investigating many more things beyond just the cosmology that I mentioned. But how can we kind of use that rational, clear approach to human problems, right? So instead of looking at the natural world, let's look at the society we've created for ourselves. What is the best kind of government? Let's do an experiment and figure it out, right? Let's get all the great minds together. Let's have a conference. Let's write an essay and figure it out. What laws are the most beneficial? What's the right tax code? Does torture work or not, right? They're interested in these big questions for how do we live together. So Enlightenment's very social oriented, with a real focus on reason and logic, right? In their mind, they're having the same approach as science. I think we know, if any of you guys are hard science majors, right? Chemistry, biology, physics, those have different rules, different rules than if you're a political science major or a sociology major, an anthropology major, right? The social sciences, psychology, right? Can't ever be the same kind of X plus Y equals Z. And I think the Enlightenment thinkers are a little naive to try, but I think we still should admire the attempt. So rejecting this idea that we should do things because we believe in them, right? Faith, custom. We shouldn't do the same things our grandparents did just because they did them. We should do them because we've thought it through and we've chosen to do them because they make sense. Emotion, no. I mean, really, Enlightenment thinkers are really uninterested in those aspects of the human condition. They really focus on a belief in progress, that let's make things better. We can improve things. We can find the perfect government. And they emphasize liberty and freedoms, both individual freedoms and political freedoms, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of press, all the things we'll talk about next week, you'll see in Revolutions. Equality, although I think we can see that, like, Jefferson means something different by equality than we might mean today, but the idea of equality is certainly there. Justice, what's fair, tolerance, especially religious tolerance, is in there as well. Enlightenment thinkers, Enlightenment art and architecture focuses on harmony and order. If you know, like Mozart's music, right? Very balanced, mathematical, and the same kind of thing with art, neoclassical art, which is in favor at this time period as well. But I want you to notice, that's why I wrote in capital letters, note, that Enlightenment philosophers, for the most part, in general, are advocates of progressive, gradual reform, not revolution. They're not saying burn down the castle. They're saying, let's work with the king. Maybe I can get an appointment with the king. And they do. They're friends. Many people are advisors to different kings across Europe. Sometimes they're called enlightened despots, enlightened monarchs, right? Because they're going to say, I want absolute power, but I want to rule in a way that's more fair. Let's bring in Voltaire. Let's read some Montesquieu. And so their idea of improving society from within, right, getting inside the structure of government and gradually modifying it rather than doing something from without. So keep that in mind, because the genie's out of the bottle, right? They can't control it. Once they start talking about equality, everyone's going to jump on board. But that's not their intention, I think, certainly, when they're originally writing, at least not for most of them. Let's look just at a few different figures here, and you can glean more from the readings. Immanuel Kant is a very famous thinker. Germany's not a country yet, but he is German, speaking German. And you read an excerpt from his famous essay, What is Enlightenment? This is a great way to start. For Kant, he says, dare to know. Have the courage to use your own reason. Again, we see this reason, right? Why dare to know? Right? I mean, I think that's something he's talking about, is that finding knowledge is hard, right? What's easy? It's easy to do what everyone tells you. It's easy to do. He's got that great phrase, right? If I have a book which understands for me, a pastor who has a conscience for me, a physician who decides my diet, and so forth, I need not trouble myself. I need not think. If I can only pay, others will readily undertake the irksome work for me. I think this is such an important idea, especially you guys are college students, right? So you're in this moment where daring to know is hard. It's hard to get rid of other ideas you've had, and look at things with new eyes and think for yourself in this way that Immanuel Kant is challenging you to make this philosophical revelation moment, an epiphany. Don't follow just what the guardians say. He says that they're treating you like cattle. Unyoke yourself and go be free. But he talks, I think, really fairly and importantly about obedience. Okay, and this is where we're talking about this gradual reform. You can complain about taxes, but you still have to pay them, right? You can be concerned about a military venture that your leader is commanding you be a part of, but you still have to follow the orders, right? So he's trying to make this balance. And I think the freedom that Kant's really interested in here as a German man in the 1700s is intellectual freedom, is freedom not just to think for yourself, but to express yourself, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. I think that would also include freedom of assembly, right? Freedom to print what you want. And then that exchange of free ideas, he finds the real place that we can kind of know ourselves better and improve society and improve the world, is sort of his call here. But notice he's not saying, again, get rid of the monarch. He's praising his monarch, but he wants to make sure that you have this call for yourself. So I think that's important and a good way to think about what is enlightenment. Voltaire is probably the quintessential Enlightenment thinker. He's French. This is his pen name, but everyone calls him Voltaire. He wrote famous plays. He's super sarcastic. He wrote a lot of satires, essays. Famously, he wrote a philosophical dictionary where he defines all these different kinds of words, like torture and tolerance. He calls for religious tolerance. He says it's not mindful, it's not fair, it's not logical to imagine that that we know which religion might be right. How dare we presume we're right? Everyone thinks they're right, and so he wants more religious tolerance. Although he himself has his own biases. He's a Frenchman, and he certainly is not somebody I think who could hold up to 21st century social media scrutiny. But for his time, right, these are the ideas that he's calling out. And so he's sort of always the funny one with the quip at a dinner party. The one with like the saying that brings somebody to their knees. Speaking truth to power kind of idea. Although he himself was very celebrated. Mary Wollstonecraft is another figure I want you to think about, and she's not in the club of Enlightenment thinkers, in part because she's a woman, right? So she's a little bit outside. But her ideas are very much part of this Enlightenment project. And she writes A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1791. And I want you to notice in that text what she says that accounts for differences between men and women. Because if you look, men and women they act very differently in society. They are taught to act very differently. And she asked this question I think we all still think about, right? Is it nature or nurture, right? Are women different because they're born different? Are they biologically different? Or are they taught to be different? Are they compelled? Are they coerced? Do they see that acting different is the only way to get ahead in a society that doesn't have a lot of avenues for them? And she talks about how to improve women's status in society, and she's really interested in education. Let's try to educate women in a different way. Let's not value women for how pretty they are, for how weak they are, for how dumb they are, so that men can be their protectors. Let's kind of flip the script here, she said. Let's try to make it where women are valuable. Think about all the great occupations women could have. All the ways they could contribute to society, right? They could be doctors, they could be nurses, they could study politics, they could study history, they could study business. This way they don't have to be prostitutes because they can exercise their minds. And right now society is not benefiting when that doesn't happen. So I think she really wants to call out for that. And I think that's worth paying attention to. There's a lot of other thinkers we could explore, but I think you get hopefully the main idea here. What we see in the Enlightenment period is not just a few, important thinkers, but really a whole culture that shifts towards print. This is the time when paper becomes cheaper, the printing process becomes cheaper, literacy rises across Europe and in the United States. Still, shepherds and peasant farmers, they're not a part of this, right? So the Enlightenment's not for everyone, but for people especially who live in towns, and for people who can read or learn to read, there's an explosion of new texts. This is an example from the discovery of a new world about astronomy and the new cosmology, but you can also imagine a lot of books being exchanged. There's a lot of other discovery going on, right? It's been 200 years, 250 years since discovering the new world, but certainly stories are coming from there. Stories are coming from Africa. Stories still circulating, the Ottoman Empire, Mughal, China, right? All of that, and of course all of these Enlightenment ideas, these essays, satires, plays. Also a lot of pornography, a lot of low stuff too. So it's not all big ideas. And what we see here, and I think this is a really fun kind of description, visual image, is what historians call the rise of the public sphere. And by public sphere, they mean this idea that people go out into public, especially to pubs, like bars, taverns, and also coffee shops, coffee houses. And they exchange ideas. Maybe there's newspapers there. Someone's left a newspaper. You can read it for free. And you can put down the newspaper and say, oh, I'm so frustrated. Why are they spending so much on taxation for this stupid war? I don't even know why we're fighting that. Or why did our king decide this? These are people who probably live in an absolute monarchy system. They have no say in their government. And they don't expect to have any say. But they start to care. And this is the rise of public opinion. And the fact that they're coming together in this kind of way that we know from social media, right? Twitter and likes, tweets and comments. But there it's actually in person, but with the media of print, to argue and talk and to feel like even people who are outside the government still have opinions about what's going on in the government. And I think you can see where this is going, right, as we get to the age of revolutions, beginning with America, moving to France, and then spreading all across the Caribbean and Latin America in the kind of the 50 years on either side of 1800. And that's a really important thing to consider. I want to end with, I think, this really helpful image that brings together kind of what does the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment mean. This is a portrait by Jacques-Louis David, a French artist, of Antoine Lavoisier, who is a chemist, the most famous French scientist of the late 1700s, and his wife Marie-Anne. And I think this tells us a lot about what's going on in Europe in these previous, 250 years or so. We see a double portrait, we see a couple, and maybe this brings us to Mary Wollstonecraft's advice, to having women be more involved. The wife is standing next to this artistic folio. She herself is actually an artist. In fact, she trains under David, and probably she's the one who commissions this portrait by David. She doesn't just paint what she wants, she also paints things for her husband. He writes the first chemistry textbook, so she helps illustrate that. And so they're working together here in their living room, which they've turned into a science lab. You can see on here, and you can go to the Met where this is in real life, but also go online and look at the picture more closely. There's a lot of really great close-ups. All of this different equipment, David's painted scrupulously. And we have the sense of like science happening at home. And I think this is important to remember, that this is not a world, and this is, I think, what Wollstonecraft is getting at too. This is not a world where men go do business and politics, in some faraway place. This is a world where a lot of stuff is happening at the home. Science and discoveries are happening at the home. Collaboration, the public sphere, it's happening. You're taking your ideas. It's happening at the tavern. It's happening at the coffee house. This exchange of ideas, this fostering of new knowledge makes these advances possible, both in terms of science, but also, if you read the blurb, Lavoisier is executed by the revolutionaries. In fact, Jacques-Louis David ends up on the other side of the French Revolution. We'll talk about next week. It's his wife who ends up celebrating his legacy, making sure he's not forgotten, promoting his ideas. But even a scientist is going to be kind of mixed in with politics, right? So there's not really separate spaces for these things. All this stuff is sort of happening at the same time. So just thinking about this collaboration of men and women, the collaboration of science and enlightenment, the collaboration of reform and revolution, these are all kind of trends that we see that I think are really important to attend to. I appreciate your patience, and reach out to me with any questions. Thank you.